we see something that seems inequitable to us, and how do we raise the issue in a constructive way so that we don't create barriers or an atmosphere where there can be barriers for people to fully engage, I guess, and fully participate?
So that's a really great question. Can you provide some more specifics around what you're thinking about when you talk about creating barriers by raising a question of inequity?
Well, even in the speech or the talk, one of the talks today, they were talking about language and how language can create barriers. Like it was Nick Marks, and he was saying that we have to be careful about judging. In other words, judging things and judging people. Sometimes people use certain language, or even they might be alienating somebody, you know, by not selecting them, similar to what was shown in your video. And then somebody can see this happening, and it can, you know, that it's not a healthy environment because for everyone, it's bad for everyone. So how does a person do this, like identify it in a delicate way that's constructive and leads to a positive change?
I like that question. And so I would offer that it requires an assessment of organizational culture, because invariably the people who are the decision makers have preferences for how they might like to be addressed about perceived inequities that take place in the, you know, in an environment, in the workplace. And so it's knowing who the decision makers and the influencers are, and then figuring out if the best course of action is to communicate directly with the person, if it is a person or a group of leaders, bringing that concern to their attention, because it might not be intentional, as we just had this conversation about unconscious bias. If the organizational climate is one where you don't believe that the leader or leaders would be very responsive to that type of concern, it could be, right, that you organize with people within the organization. And instead of making it about an individual who's experiencing the inequity, asking people who have lesser degrees of power or influence, and we're going to talk about power a little bit later on, to collectively organize. And so it might mean that you are being strategic in a form of advocacy that's group-oriented. It could be that you're aligning yourself with an ally or a sponsor who can influence the decision makers. And so ultimately, what I'm suggesting is that you need to take a strategic approach based on the context of the organizational culture, because one thing that's really, really fundamental to remember is that human beings, we all have egos, right? And so people don't like to have their flaws pointed out, even if their shortcomings or omissions are on a public display. People often don't like for those shortcomings to be called out in a public way. So it's taking a strategic approach to see what's the best way to communicate what I've observed so that I could be understood and well received. And that might be individual, it might be collective action. Any other questions?